Hey guys, welcome to the first episode of the new year. Happy New Year, everybody. And I wanted to have our most popular guest return and give us his economic outlook for the economy and his outlook for commodities, most notably gold. And with everything going on, and it's a lot, our guest today is going to tell us what we should be doing, not only to survive in this environment, but also how to protect ourselves in these massive headwinds that we're facing and will face, but also how we can thrive. So folks, here we go.
If you have concerns about your financial future, let's be honest, the world shapes your wallet. We're taking you behind the scenes to look at what's really happening in the real world. Inform, prepare, and empower. This is the Full Disclosure Podcast with your host, John MacGregor.
All right, before we get into it, don't forget to ring that bell below and hit subscribe. You do not want to miss future episodes. And I also wanted to mention again that my new cash flow masterclass is now available, where I teach you what I call the 60-minute cash flow and wealth building strategy that generates cash flow instantly on every single trade. And by the way, this is not day trading. It's a well-proven strategy. I just codified into a step-by-step process that anyone can learn. So check it out on my website. I think you'll find it interesting. All right, so let's get into it. It is an honor and a privilege for me to introduce my friend Andy Schectman to the show. And in my honest opinion, I've said this before, having spoken with a lot of, quote, gurus in the world of gold, Andy is the real deal when it comes to precious metals, most notably, especially gold. He's been in the business, the financial game, for over 33 years, and he's the big boss at Miles Franklin Precious Metals, a company that recently surpassed $9 billion in sales. Yeah, you heard that right, $9 billion in sales. And one reason I have so much respect for Andy is that he's got this knack. He's got this knack for diving into economic history, which really gives him some crazy insight into what's going to happen down the road. And you'll see what I mean in just a moment. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Andy. It's awesome to have you here.
John, I think we can end the interview right now, as a matter of fact. I mean, with that interview, I don't know if I can, if it's going to get any better.
All right, so let's call it a day.
Reputation. Yeah. But thank you so much for the kind words, for the introduction, and Happy New Year to you as well, and everyone out there. So thanks for having me back.
I appreciate it. No, like I said, you've been our most popular guest, so I want to get you on and kick off the new year with you.
Thank you.
And I thought we'd start off with the macro on what's happening in the world today, because you have such great insight on that. And then we can shift to the micro. In other words, what people should be doing with their money. But first, I was thinking about this. As a country, you realize we just hit $34 trillion in debt. $34 trillion in debt this week. 100 days ago, only 100 days ago, we were at $33 trillion. I mean, think about that rate of increase in debt. And sadly, you know, when I tell people that, most people just kind of roll their eyes and shrug their shoulders. They don't even know what's happening. People must wake up, and that's the purpose of the show. And now, Andy, the interest expense to service that debt is $1.1 trillion. Remember, we only take in $5 trillion in revenue. And that $1.1 trillion in interest, that's $250 billion more than our defense budget. It's $250 billion more than Medicare. And we'll soon surpass the $1.35 trillion we spend on Social Security, which will mean interest on our debt will be the biggest single expense this country has. And then lastly, before I turn it over to Andy, I get riled up on this stuff. Before I turn it over to Andy, our deficit spending, which is how much we spend more than we bring in. And just to clarify, because I know I got a lot of questions on this, people get a little bit confused. Our debt, that's the $34 trillion that I mentioned, is like the amount of money you have on a credit card that you're carrying and that you have to pay interest on, right? The deficit is how much you overspend your budget every year. And right now, as a country, we spend $2 trillion more than we bring in every single year. And no one in Washington has the guts to take this on. That means we're spending 40% more of what we bring in terms of revenue. So with that, I'll stop, Andy. Let's kick it off with this. I'd love your thoughts on the state of this economy based on what I just said and where you think we're headed economically. What say you?
I don't think you could have really said it better, and again, you're right on all accounts. Let's first make it easy in layman's terms, for people to understand. You know, you and I are roughly the same age or in the same generation. And, you know, if you go back to when you were a teenager in the 80s, $100 went a long way. We dreamed of making $1 million. There was always that commercial. I don't remember what it was for, but it was a guy driving a sports car saying, I made my first million at 35 and whatever. The point of it is that millions were something we strive for, and it was obtainable if you worked hard. Most people will have made $1 million in their lives. If they work hard, they probably haven't saved that much, but by all measurements, million is obtainable. So the number flows. And then we see billionaires now all of a sudden all over the place. And, I guess it's obtainable if you are really, really successful, I mean, it's possible, right? Anything's possible. So I don't think people quite understand how big a trillion is, because it sounds an awful lot like a million and a billion, but to put it in perspective, a trillion seconds ago was 31,688 years ago.
Wow.
So when you talk about how big a trillion seconds was, it's Neanderthals stalking the plains of Europe. Now that's 1 trillion. And you mentioned a $34 trillion debt. I agree with you. We do have a $34 trillion debt. We just paid $170 billion in interest payments in the last 2 months. So you're right on everything that you're saying. But one thing that is being left out, and is left out too frequently when people have this discussion, is off-balance sheet unfunded liabilities. In other words, promises that we have made that we're on the hook for, like Social Security, which is $77 trillion, $77 trillion in IOUs. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, government military pensions, these are all off balance sheet. And when you add them together, you're north of 150 trillion in funded and unfunded liabilities by the government's own admission. And it gets even more sickening from here, in the respect that by their 2022 balance sheet, if you Google it and you'll read it, you'll see that they have just over 5 trillion in assets against 150 trillion in liabilities, some funded, some not funded. And when you realize that of that 5 trillion in assets, the largest asset, according to the United States government, on their balance sheet, as pathetic and sickening and nauseating as it is student debt. So when this president of ours, who has a hard time putting 6 words together, says, well, we just gave, some student debt relief to the tune of, I don't know how many billions of dollars, it's really, it's nothing, really. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny bit he's scraping away from the largest asset of the U.S. government. So when you take student debt, John, out of the equation, that 40% of the U.S. government's asset base, we have just over $3.5 trillion in assets standing behind 150 trillion in liabilities. We are at the 130% debt to GDP line that in all of history, no one has ever crossed over without defaulting, either outright or by hyperinflation. And, when you talk about the Congressional Budget Office of the U.S. government, they just came out with a statement. And they said, to your point, John, that in 7 short years, by 2031, 100% of the tax receipts that they take in will go to pay just the interest on the debt, not the principal, just the interest and mandatory entitlement payments like Social Security, which isn't even on the balance sheet. It's just a bunch of crap, right? So they don't tell you the truth, but let's phrase it a different way. How is it that we can expect the U.S. government or the United States to maintain its role as the dominant economic powerhouse and military superpower in the world when 100% of discretionary spending, which includes military spending, has to be borrowed? Where this year alone in 2024, $10 trillion plus in Treasury obligations these treasuries come due. So we have to come up with 10 trillion just to pay the obligations. Where does that come from? Oh, I got a good idea. How about we borrow some more money at higher rates to pay back what we owe? And so it's becoming a situation that I think is becoming more and more and more difficult for the U.S. to maintain its position in the world when we are, in essence, insolvent and broke. And yet we haven't stopped spending. We're addicted to spending, and yet we have to borrow money to continue to spend and to do all of these things that really we have no business doing. And you know, it's only going to get worse. I think that's part of the problem that the rest of the world is seeing right now.
Wow, you just unloaded a ton there, Andy. So I got a lot of questions for you. So we saw our last bond issuance, right? It didn't go very well. There wasn't a whole lot of demand for our bonds, which means, or does that mean you think interest rates are going back up and we have not seen the end of this inflation? We're now hearing by the press, of course, that inflation's over, it's been tamed, it's a soft landing. What's your take on that?
Not even close. I think inflation is here to stay. I think inflation wasn't conquered. I think the Fed gave into inflation. They realize if they continue to raise rates that they'll break the system, they'll break the economy, they'll break the commercial real estate market, they'll break the banks that are completely tied to the commercial real estate market, they'll break everything. And they know that. I think just like the United Nations has requested, this 2% inflation target that the governments are striving to achieve is unrealistic. And if you look at what real inflation is, it's 10%. Go to shadowstats.com, John Williams. He'll show you what real inflation is. And to think that inflation is under control is a mistake. How do we pay for all of these unfunded liabilities? How do we pay for all of this stuff, the Medicare, the Medicaid, the Social Security? And I think by acquiescing and giving in to, to pivoting, if you will, to no longer raising rates, but to, in fact, decrease rates, you've signaled inflation is here to stay. And ultimately, I believe what the lesson that the Federal Reserve will learn is that the market ultimately is bigger than they are. And I think that has to do maybe a year or two or three down the road. But when the dollar is no longer demanded, really, in fact, it is shunned because we have chosen inflation over austerity. I think that they'll understand that, and rates will have to go higher to attract people to buy our debt. I mean, look, our debt will always have buyers, but at what rate?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And I think indeed, I think inflation is here to stay, and I think ultimately rates go higher. Short-term rates may be on the way down for a little bit, but ultimately I see rates going much, much higher.
I do too. I agree. They're going to have to go higher for people to attract the bond buyers. And for people to say that inflation's at 2% is just an absolute lie. You mentioned 10%. I don't know anything that I spend that isn't 10% higher than it was a year ago and 10% higher than it was before that. So this idea that inflation is tamed and we've had a soft landing is just absolute nonsense. So I want to, based on all that, Andy, I want to shift gears and talk about the dollar and BRICS, because it's all interrelated, right? And I do want to ask, all of this economic collapse that we're seeing right in front of our eyes, it's plain as day, and everything that's going on at the border and oil and crime and all of this stuff and the economic, and the spending, the debt we're accumulating. In your opinion, Andy, is all this being done on purpose? Is this all by design? And then, and then I want to shift gears and talk about the dollar and BRICS, because I haven't heard much about BRICS lately. And by the way, for listeners that aren't familiar with BRICS, BRICS is an acronym of 5 countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that have come together to form an alliance to create a new currency to replace the dollar backed by gold. And now it's not only 5 countries, there's probably, Andy, you would know better, 20 or 30 other countries that have joined. Again, this is designed to replace the dollar as the world currency, which would have a massive, massive destructive effect on us and our living standards in this country. But it's interesting. I have not heard much about BRICS lately, but I did read this in the Wall Street Journal. An estimated 20% of global oil in 2023 was bought and sold in other currencies other than the dollar. 20%. Yep. The United Arab Emirates, Brazil, Russia, China, Iran, they are really aggressively looking to take the dollar down. So that's a lot I'm throwing at you.
That's okay. And as far as I'm concerned, they're very important topics. It's really my focus.
Yep.
Now, to your first question, is this done intentionally? I'd like to draw your attention to 2 economic advisors, the top 2 economic advisors to the United States government, and then I'll unpack it. The first one is Jared Bernstein, and he is. We've talked about this before. I've mentioned it on other interview with you or with your group, and this is a man whose main thesis is to lose the world reserve status. That is a privilege we can no longer afford.
He has said that.
He has written reports. Yeah, he has written reports in both the Washington Post and the New York Post. One report he wrote was called "Dethrone King Dollar." Another one, when Trump slapped tariffs on China, he said, good, maybe we'll lose the reserve status. It was picked up in the Washington Post. Now let's look what the United States government did first and foremost. We weaponized the dollar, and we not only sanctioned Iran and Russia, but in terms of Russia, they're talking about confiscating those assets, not just sanctioning them and using them to rebuild the Ukraine. Now, the rest of the world is saying, hey, are we next? If we fall on the wrong side of the Western agenda, what does that mean? That's object number one. And I think when you talk about being the steward of the reserve currency, it is not our prerogative to be able to say, you can use it, but you can't because we like what you did and you didn't. I mean, look, we're the country that went into Iraq 20 years ago, destroyed their country under the guise of weapons of mass destruction. We are still occupying them. We are still sanctioning 14 of their banks right now because they had the audacity to trade with Iran to buy liquid natural gas to cool their homes in the middle of a 120-degree summer. And they made $90 billion in oil revenue last year. And that money they can't control. It's held by the New York Fed. They asked the New York Fed recently, can we have $1 billion, please? And they said no. So, Iraq has now said they want to join BRICS. They said they're kicking all U.S. coalition forces out of the country. They've made trading in dollars illegal. If you own a business, you'll go to jail. And all green dollar bills are out of the country now as of today, January 1st was the deadline. But when you talk about what's happening, well, we weaponize the dollar and then we sign an executive order to go green because remember, it is the protection of Saudi Arabia and OPEC that has given us the dollar hegemony, that has given us the petrodollar. And when we signed an executive order to go green after we weaponized the dollar, what does that say to Saudi Arabia? Now, I've made a big deal about Saudi Arabia. And I made a big deal because they're really the linchpin of it here. I made a big deal that they, along with every other OPEC country, has joined the Belt Road Initiative, the Chinese infrastructure project, the largest in human history, that right now comprises 75% of human population and 50% of global GDP in and of itself. Just that. Now, every one of the OPEC countries are there. That's ominous. Number two, I talked about how they joined the BRICS and as of January 1st have been formally approved and admitted. And both the BRICS nations and Saudi Arabia says that, yep, that's the case. We're in. It's done. I made a big deal about how they joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is the largest regional financial and military organization on the planet. I made a big deal about how they joined the BRICS New Development Bank. All of these things kept happening and happening and happening. And I really made a big deal about them telling the folks at the World Bank meeting earlier this year that, yeah, we're open to taking other currencies for oil. As you mentioned, 20% of global oil has sold in other currencies. And, for the last 50 years, it's been nearly 100% of oil sales have been in US dollars. It's given it a synthetic demand. But here's the kicker. And this is something that it's been hard to find. MSN put this article out, but it's hard to find it. And that is that if you go back 2 weeks, you see United Arab Emirates, who you mentioned. They hosted a United Nations summit in Dubai. 200 delegates from countries around the world came to Dubai for a United Nations summit on climate control. Now, ironically enough, it was presided over by the chairman of the United Arab Emirates state-owned oil company. He told the former president of Ireland, if we do this, if we go green, you're going to send civilization back to the caves, just saying. But here's where it gets crazy. Now, let's keep in mind, before I tell you what gets crazy, that the United Arab Emirates is the 7th largest producer of oil in the world. They are an OPEC member. They just were admitted to and are formally in BRICS alongside Saudi Arabia, right? So now they're in BRICS, they're an OPEC member, and they host this meeting. But 2 days before they host this meeting, they tell the world we are no longer taking for oil going forward. You heard me right. The United Arab Emirates, who's now a BRICS member, part of OPEC, seventh largest producer in the world. No, we're not going to take dollars anymore. Now, it gets even more provocative than that. And that's a massive shot across the bow, right? Not as provocative as Saudi Arabia and all of OPEC saying we're done, but it's a big one. But what gets crazier than that, John, is that the day after the summit ended in Dubai, Putin, who hasn't left his country but once or twice in the last few years because of the Western bounty on him, flew in an impromptu meeting to the United Arab Emirates, flanked by 4 MiG fighter jets. And what did he have to say? Do you think he said, listen, we see what they did to Gaddafi and Hussein, don't worry, we've got your back? I don't know. And then he goes right from there to Saudi Arabia. And after he leaves Saudi Arabia, OPEC announces a 2 million barrel, not one, they increase it to 2 million barrel a day decrease in oil production. So my point to you is simply this, that we are accelerating the pace at which these countries are uniting. Now, as of January 1st, the 5 countries that you mentioned, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are now 10. And that would be Ethiopia, Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Now, 20 other countries have formally applied. And, you know, I could go through them all. It would take a minute or two. But the one key characteristic with every one of the countries that have formally applied, I'll read the list quickly here, and I'll omit what I want to talk about in terms of the traits of each one of these companies, and I'll capsulize it. Countries: Afghanistan, Algeria, Bangladesh, Bolivia, Cuba, Ecuador, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Nicaragua, Nigeria, Pakistan, Senegal, Sri Lanka, Sudan, Thailand, Turkey, Uruguay, Uzbekistan, and Venezuela. In every single case, every one of these countries have 2 things in common, 1 or 2. One, for sure, is they are very, very rich in natural resources, from rare earth metals to precious metals to all sorts of commodities that the world will need moving forward. And 2, they are key choke points in terms of shipping lanes and routes. If all of these countries sign up, which they've formally applied, they will control the Red Sea, they will control the Straits of Hormuz, they will control the majority of these strategic shipping lanes. And it's a very, very big deal. 20 other countries have informally expressed interest, including Mexico. So you have potentially another 40, if not more, countries that will become part of this BRICS alliance by October of 2024, as the meeting moves and as the presidency moves from South Africa formally to Russia. Another thing about the BRICS is that they share the presidency. Each year, the presidency moves. There isn't one voice here. And I think that's the whole premise of these countries, or this alliance, is finding safety in numbers. And where in and of themselves, these countries could not stand up against the West and the military might and the potential economic fallout. But these countries together, you're talking well in excess of the majority of human population, way larger gross domestic product, way larger military might, and a formidable group of countries that will control not only much of the shipping lanes and strategic routes, but the majority of all of the world's commodities and largely energy supply, including the majority of the rare earth metals that obviously we haven't thought out too well, because supposedly we're going green fully by 2050, 50% by 2030. And that's what we've told the Saudis. Hey, thanks, guys. Thanks for the 50 years. But we're going the other way. And that's why I think you saw Saudi Arabia, their crown prince, just a couple of months ago, come out and say something very poignant. He said, China this year is our most strategic trading partner for oil, and for the next 50 years. Well, what is it right now? It's 50 years since we signed the petrol contract with Saudi Arabia, and now they're saying China is our most important strategic trading partner in oil for the next 50 years. So a transition is underway, and I think people need to understand one thing. The synthetic demand for the dollar that has been created over the last 50 years, where every country's had to stockpile them to buy dollars or to buy oil, has created an environment not only of an illusionary environment of demand for the dollar. And maybe illusionary is not the right word, but synthetic certainly is. But what happens when they no longer need to hold them and dump them? And that's the moment where maybe we get into the Klaus Schwab discussion, not today, but that's what happens, because all of those dollars get dumped simultaneously, hitting our shores, creating a hyperinflationary event where interest rates go to the moon. And that is a very, very bad omen in the respect that all of these asset prices and the banks, which are all inversely correlated to that moment, it's a religious experience at that moment. So I hope we don't get there. Yeah. But I will tell you, the BRICS are gaining legitimacy quickly, and it's something not to be taken lightly, especially in light of what the United Arab Emirates just did.
Wow, that was tremendous. Thank you so much, Andy. So insightful. So, I think people need to realize this is so much bigger than just another currency to trade goods and services in. This is a geopolitical coalition that's coming together. It could be a new military coalition, actually, that could be a huge threat to the United States and the rest of the world. Not only and supply chains, as you mentioned, Andy, and
two of the three largest nuclear arsenals on the planet, too, John. So they're not to be taken lightly.
And there you go. It's exactly right. So
now, if you don't mind, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, I just want to make one other point, and that is what you said earlier. So that's one end of it, right? That's Jared Bernstein. Let's blow up the world reserve currency, but Lael Brainerd is a modern monetary theorist, and she wants to get rid of the banks. So all of this is, she wants to issue a central bank digital currency. Right. She ran point for Fed Now, which is Venmo and Zelle on steroids, backed by the Fed. But in order for all of this to happen, I think you have to have the right environment in the United States. And to your point, we have lawlessness, we have divisiveness, where red and blue can't even speak anymore. We have a situation where I think people are questioning around the world. They look at our open borders. They look at the fact that, Lady Liberty is blind or blindfolded holding the scales of justice. And I think a lot of people are asking themselves, I don't care what side of the aisle you're on, has the former president, the current president been treated equally? Mm-hmm. Is it fair? Look at this 14th Amendment nonsense where, again, doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on. This is a purposeful destruction of our democracy in the respect that last time this happened, it was Abraham Lincoln, and there was a civil war that happened directly after. So this is a very bad thing because it's a cultural whitewashing and a cultural war in the midst of an economic catastrophe potentially, or certainly an event where you could see big problems with the economy. You add that into the cultural war, and it's a very bad thing. You get a lot of emotion, and I think this is something that I think you can't make up. What our leaders are doing, both outside the United States and inside the United States, it's just too stupid to be stupid. And when you look at what would potentially happen in that environment where interest rates spike, the banks blow up. But that's exactly what Lael Brainerd wants, so she can issue you a central bank digital currency. And if you look at who all of these unfunded liabilities are owed to, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, government military pensions, and all of the bonds that are being dumped by Russia and China and all of these countries that are dumping bonds, right? Who's buying them all? It's us. It's the hedge funds. It's the advisors chasing yield. So if that moment happens and if everything blows up, two things happen. One, you have a villain to point to. It's OPEC and Xi Jinping and Putin. And two, you're defaulting largely on the American public. But have no fear, John, because Lael Brainerd is here with their central bank digital currency. Sign on the dotted line. We are modern monetary theorists, after all, and we will make you whole.
That's exactly right.
So could it be done by design? You bet your rear end it could be. And I do largely believe it is either that or our politicians are completely stupid. And I think they're smart. They're stupid. I mean, you can be smart and stupid at the same time. You can be smart and diabolical at the same time. They know what they're doing. And I think it's a scary thought if you go down that rabbit hole.
Well, I think you hit it on the head, and there's no scarier proposition than someone who's smart and diabolical. You put those two together and you're in real trouble. I say there's no conspiracy theories, but there's no coincidences either. I mean, you just look what's going on. And this administration, by the way, you just look at the backgrounds. As you mentioned, Jared Bernstein, he studied music and social services. I think he has a master's or a doctorate degree in the French Horn. This guy knows nothing about the economy, and yet he's the leading economic advisor. And then you have our Secretary of State, Blinken, and our Secretary of Defense, Austin. I mean, these are just amateur clowns that are put in charge. And then you have Mayorkas at the border, who has just basically, and sometimes I don't blame Mayorkas, because he's doing what he's been told by the administration. Open this border as much as you possibly can, and then pretend that you're doing everything you can to close it. And then, of course, our press secretary, KGP, which is unbelievably ridiculous. I know. There. But going back to, is this being done by design? I mean, you just look what they're doing to the economy. Social Security is going to be bankrupt by 2033. And if I do my math, that's in 10 years. Medicare as well. The unfunded liabilities that you talked about. Taxes are going to have to go up. We have inflation through the roof still to this day. Crime is rampant. We're no longer energy independent. Men can give babies. We have drag shows in libraries and schools. I mean, we've become a banana republic, and it's all being done, in my opinion, by design, because they're just sitting on their thumbs doing nothing. Because the ultimate goal, Andy, in my strong opinion, is a centralized digital currency. That is their nirvana. That is their utopia, because the left's end game, they are laser focused like robots to control every aspect of our lives. What we eat, how we travel, how often we travel, what we say, what appliances we use. They want to control every aspect of our lives. And it goes off to, the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab. We can get into that in another discussion. But the end goal is a centralized business digital currency. That's why they are letting this thing crumble. To your point, so they can.
I mean, how many people know that Biden signed that into executive order as well?
That's right. No one does.
And that Lael Brainerd worked in conjunction with MIT when she was at the Boston Fed in development of the central bank digital currency. And the only way that you get people to take a central bank digital currency, because, look, I know the circles that you walk in, and people that you talk to are highly educated and successful. And so they're not going to take it. Well, but what happens if everything blows up? And that the blowing up wasn't our fault. It was those guys. They did it to us. So everything blows up. Everyone is brought down to a common denominator, and then are incentivized strongly to take the CBDC. Absolutely. And I think if you just take all partisan politics out of it and just look at the border, how the hell is this being allowed? How the hell can we allow? And look, when we send troops to a foreign country, do we send 10 million of them? No, we don't. And so 10 million is an invasion. And it's an invasion that is being done for very nefarious reasons. Many of them, we have no idea where they're from or what they're all about. And then you get the FBI saying, we're very concerned about homegrown terrorist cells. So, gee, I wonder why. And so, when you talk about these types of, look, I think all you have to do is think to yourself, every little boy and girl who grew up around the world wanted to come to the United States. They watch US TV, they listen to music, they inspired to the things that we have maybe taken for granted: freedom, liberty, the First Amendment, the ability to, freedom of religion, freedom to protest, all of these wonderful things that made this country what it is. And they look at this country now and say, what the hell is happening in the United States? They're completely astray from the fundamentals that made the United States great. And I think the biggest one is liberty and justice. Justice in particular. And I question, is it being administered equally? And the elections and the open borders, I think we are, along with all the woke ideology that you're talking about, which is ridiculous, and cancel culture and censorship. I mean, all of this stuff you couldn't make it up anymore. And I think if it was just the mismanagement of the dollar, we'd be okay, because people would still aspire to be, or to come to the United States, to be part of this wonderful country. But when they look at it now, they say, my God, what is this, the Rocky Horror Picture Show? What's going on? And I think that's when you ask could this be done by design? Look, we should be doing everything we can to cling to the world reserve status, to say, no, we're not going green. We're going to do what we can to be, clean in the way that we do things. But no, we realize that we need fossil fuels in order to run the world. Okay, fine. But to tell Saudi Arabia we're going green and to weaponize the dollar against major countries in the world, 2 of them are BRICS members, you're out of your mind. And then let all of this stuff happen here and do such crazy things like try and pull Trump off of the ballot when he hasn't even been convicted. It's just absolutely un-American. And I think it's the one thing that the world is seeing. And I think we are losing confidence, and certainly we are not the inspiration and admiration of those little boys and girls who want to come to this country, and they grow up shaking their head at what the hell has the U.S. become. So I think indeed you could make a very sound argument. Occam's razor, the most logical answer prevails. Yeah, this probably is being done by Zion, and if it's not, then we really need to completely get rid of everyone in power and start over again and go back to the fundamentals this country stood for to begin with.
Yeah, and you wonder if that's even possible, if that train's left the station. But Andy, sadly, we're already over time. But if you don't mind just spending a couple more minutes, given everything that we just talked about, what should people be doing now? I know you get that question all the time. Maybe it's, hey, I've got some money. How much should I put in gold? Or how should I protect myself? Because there's ways, no matter what's going on, people can do well and thrive. What's your recommendation?
I mean, look, I sell precious metals. My company, Miles Franklin, has been around for 33 years. I have an affinity for them, but I look at them, John, not as an investment, but as wealth. Wealth that has outlived 2 world wars, German hyperinflation, the Great Depression, every pandemic, every awful thing that's ever happened. But wealth that at the same time has been accumulated more copiously over the last 2 years by the most powerful, well-funded, and well-informed traders on the planet, the central banks, have bought more gold over the last 2 years than at any time in central bank history. Gold was reclassified the world's only other tier 1 reserve asset next to US dollars and treasuries. There's something significant going on with precious metals. And I guess I would simply say, look, prepare like there's a hurricane coming. It's not a bad idea to have food, water, batteries, a gun with bullets, some gold, some silver, some small bills, cash on hand, all of those things. But when you're talking about, how you do this, I think you do it methodically the way the BRICS countries are, slowly, methodically, and every single chance you get, pay yourself first, if you will, every paycheck. I don't care if it's $25 and buy an ounce of silver or buy some supplies that you need. Just make sure that you are prepared for what's coming, because our mutual friend, Robert Kiyosaki, has said many times, and he said something that has stuck with me a lot, and I use it a lot. I borrow it from him, so I like to give him credit, and that is that people can't get out of the way of what they don't see coming, and I think that's very apropos. Gold hit all-time highs in the London Metals Exchange last week and all-time highs in GLD, yet it is completely ignored by the mainstream. I'll never understand it. So you pay yourself first. You try to minimize the amount of debt you have. Get out of debt before you start buying gold. Get out of debt. Pay yourself first. Accumulate gold and silver and or Bitcoin or whatever it is that you like on a habitual, methodical basis. That was the one rule my father told me 34 years ago this February when I started this company as a 19-year-old with him. He said, you will buy something every 2 weeks. Okay, Dad, I'll do that. And that's 34 years later. I own the company now for almost 25 years, but I've honored my promise to him. And it's the greatest gift he ever gave me, the ability to get out of the rat race. Here, another homage to Robert and his game. But to get out of the rat race, the only way you do is to pay yourself first. So, and I think that's the best advice I can give anyone and be methodical about it.
I got the same advice from my dad. So real quick, Andy, it's a subjective question. Is there a percentage that somebody should have in gold or precious metals?
I would work backwards from that, because if I told you what I believed, I'd lose credibility instantly.
Right.
But I would simply say this: you work backwards from the fact that we are a country that is 130% debt to GDP. No one has ever come back from that without default or hyperinflation. We are a country that has $5 trillion in assets, of which 40% is student debt. over 1.6 trillion and 150 trillion in debt. We are broke, we are insolvent, and I would work backwards from there. What percentage of your assets do you want that in a currency that in 7 years, 100% of everything discretional, including military, needs to be borrowed? I mean, at what point does it become crazy? So I would work backwards from that. And I think I would minimize my exposure to the dollar when other people would tell you, minimize your exposure to gold and silver. That 5 or 10% financial advisors say, they say that for self-serving reasons, because they know that when you pull that money out of their advisory service, that it ain't coming back. And the way these people make money is keeping it under management. So I would simply say, do your own soul searching. But I would say the biggest problem you have is not being a contrarian. If you are not a contrarian right now, I believe you'll be a victim.
Yeah.
And I look at the fact that you have gold reaching all-time highs on the LBMA and on GLD, and no one sees it as an incredibly bullish contrarian event. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'll put it to you this way. 25% to me is low.
Okay.
But
all right,
that's a personal decision.
No, that's good. That's a great answer. I appreciate how you frame that. And I love how you say, if you're not a contrarian, you'll be a victim. That was great. So lastly, Andy, if someone wanted to buy gold, are they buying coins, bars? What are they doing?
They buy whatever they want. We offer both, but there's a whole bunch of states right now. Texas, Utah, Nevada, Alaska, Idaho, Missouri, Kansas, North Carolina, Arkansas, Oklahoma, all these states that have either passed laws in their legislature or have them in front of the legislature right now that say legal tender coins made by one of the major sovereign governments. Only one or two of them say just U.S. Most say any sovereign government would be used for all debts, public and private, including paying your property taxes. In other words, as currency. And the fact that that's happening is something I never thought I'd ever see in my life. So what you are basically saying here is that the bullion coins, the American eagle or buffalo, the maple leaf from Canada, the Australian kangaroo, the Philharmonic from Austria, the United Kingdom Britannia, or the South African Krugerrand, these are legal tender coins that the law says the value of the coin plus any market premium, not the face value, but the melt value. So I think if I had my choice, I would buy coins from one of those 6 mints. And if I really had my choice, I would buy the American gold and silver eagle or the American gold buffalo. They don't make a silver buffalo, just a silver eagle. That to me is the best choice. Okay. And it gives you the greatest liquidity. And when you talk about owning assets like precious metals, you want something that is immediately liquid, free from subjectivity anywhere you go. And here in North America, that would be, or in the United States for sure, that would be the American eagle.
Okay, so American eagle, primary one, obviously, and you want to make sure. I mean, how does somebody know that it's not some knockoff from China?
It's a good question. I guess I would simply say you buy from a reputable company, number one. But look, gold and silver have been money for 5,000 years, largely because of the attributes. You put a piece of gold in your hand, it plays tricks with your mind. It feels much heavier than it looks. And I think you'll know right away, immediately, but you don't buy on the cheap. We'll be one of the most competitive companies in America. We've done almost 10 billion in sales and never had a customer complaint ever in almost 34 years this February. And we're licensed and bonded in the state of Minnesota, but there are other companies out there that are equally as reputable as ours. I'm just saying, do not buy fly by night. Do not always just think that the cheapest price in North America is the best. Do your due diligence. Work with a company that has a great track record. I know we do, but I understand that people are working with other companies to have relationships. That's fine. Just make sure you're working with one with a great reputation, and you'll never have that problem.
On that note, how does somebody find your company? How does somebody find you? How does somebody buy gold or silver or other commodities?
So, we have a website, milesfranklin.com. Okay. We only allow up to $10,000 purchasing on there. The best way to get our best pricing and to get any questions answered, non-obligatory, no obligation, is to send us an email at info at milesfranklin.com and just let us know that you would like to see our special price sheet. The price sheet that we will email you is about as competitive as anything in the country, yet we do not publish it on our website. And any questions that you have on precious metals IRAs, on storage accounts, on anything you've heard here today, I have 12 or 13 brokers that all of them are dear, dear personal friends of mine going back most of my life. Many of them have very distinguished previous careers on Wall Street or Wharton grads or Masters of Business Administration from Temple University. We got really sophisticated men and women who know what they're talking about in politics, geopolitics, economics, mathematics, logic. But if you just want to place an order, you can do that too. But it would be best to ask any questions or just simply say, hey, please send me your price list and we will do so with no obligation. Info at milesfranklin.com would be the best way to do that.
Wow, that's tremendous service. Thank you so much. Andy, thanks so much for your time today. Really, really appreciate it, especially in the new year. I know things are really busy at this time, so I'm really honored to have you. Just a ton of great information. I swear I could sit here and talk with you all day long.
Well, I could too, John, and have me back anytime. From the first day I met you, I thought you were very, very intriguing in the topics that you talked about in your book, something I find very, very, very fascinating. And I love having these conversations with like-minded people like yourself. So
thanks so much.
Honestly, I'm a text or a phone call away. You will never have to ask me twice. It's an honor to be here with you as well. So thank you for the invite. And happy, healthy New Year to your family and to everyone out there. I do hope to come back and pick up where we left off, hopefully not too far down the road.
Absolutely. And we'll love to have you. I know my listeners will love to have you back on. So with that, thanks everyone. Always a blast. Again, don't forget, hit subscribe. You don't want to miss our future episodes. We've got some great guests lined up. Also, please leave a comment. It's always great getting feedback, your ideas, or suggestions for other topics that you want to hear about. As always, have a great weekend. Aloha.
Thanks for listening and supporting Full Disclosure. If you like this episode, remember to like and subscribe and follow Full Disclosure. To make a better financial plan for your future, join our Cash Flow Bootcamp, where John shows you a safe and smart way to turn your investments into a steady income stream in a fraction of your time. Learn to make money in any market. Until next time.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.